It all began with a boy stepping off a train and wandering into the busy station. Although he looked like countless others there that day, unfortunately he stood out to one very important and very deranged person. This was the beginning of a nightmare that would become one of the most disturbing and gruesome incidents in the city's history. And although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. Friedel Rothe had only been gone for a few hours when the reality of what he had done started to hit him. He was just a teenager who had had one bad argument too many at home and convinced himself he needed space, and Hanover in the German Empire felt like the natural place to run. It was a busy, noisy city full of people who wouldn't think twice at the sight of a kid with nowhere else to go. If you wanted to disappear for a while, this seemed like as good a place as any. When he arrived near the central station, the first thing that struck Friedel was how overwhelming everything was. People bargained loudly for food, vendors shoved random goods at anyone who made eye contact, older teens hung around in groups and sized up the newcomers. There were even men who looked like they practically lived on the steps of the buildings. It's probably safe to say that it didn't take long before Friedel realized how far out of his element he was. Still, he tried to act like he belonged, and he wandered the Schieber market stalls and tried to figure out what to do next. That's when he first noticed a man that many people in the area seemed to be familiar with. He looked like someone who had some level of authority, and he lingered around the station entrances, talking with vendors and monitoring the groups of boys loitering nearby. And it didn't take long for the man to notice Friedel too. Friedel stuck out because he was alone and looking unsure despite his attempt to blend in. The man eventually approached Friedel and told him he looked lost. Friedel admitted that he wasn't from around there, and the man responded like that was a story he had already heard 1,000 different times. He introduced himself as Fritz Haarmann and said he could help Friedel get something to eat and maybe figure out where he could stay. Friedel had watched people encounter Fritz without any fear or hesitancy, and the way he talked made it seem like he had worked around the station all the time. Even so, Friedel initially hesitated on Fritz's offer, but not for long. He was already cold, hungry, dirty, and tired of pretending like he had any kind of plan. So when Fritz motioned for him to follow, Friedel did. They walked a short distance to an apartment building with narrow hallways and rooms packed close together. Fritz then took out his keys, unlocked his front door, and invited Friedel into his apartment. Not much is known about what happened once the door slammed shut that day in September of 1918, but it was the last time Friedel was ever seen or heard from. Friedel's family, meanwhile, was immediately concerned by his decision to run away, and they had already begun looking for him. And their search eventually brought them to Hanover. After speaking to a handful of people at the Schieber market, they ran into someone who knew their son and told them that the last he knew, Friedel had gone off with a man who lived at 27 Sellerstrasse. It took some convincing on the part of the Rothes, but authorities finally relented in October and decided to make contact with this man Friedel was last seen with. The police, along with the Rothes, made their way to the address and busted down the door to find Fritz in bed with a partially unclothed 13-year-old boy. This was enough to get Fritz arrested and charged with assault and battery of a minor, and it gave police reason to search the apartment. What followed was a search that could be described as not very thorough, and when they finished, they uncovered no evidence that Friedel was ever there. If they had taken time to look more closely, though, they might have found his decapitated head wrapped in newspaper behind the stove. Fritz Haarmann grew up in a home where nothing ever really felt stable. He was born in 1879 in Hanover as the youngest of 6 children, and by then his parents were already dealing with more strain than they knew how to handle. His father, Ollie, had a reputation for being moody and confrontational. He worked on the railway for a while, but when Fritz's mother, Joanna, received an inheritance, Ollie decided he had enough of regular employment. The money that Joanna received didn't exactly make the Haarmanns rich, but it kept the bills paid and Ollie took full advantage of it. Joanna was older than her husband and far more patient. She poured most of her energy into the youngest child as Fritz quickly became the one she hovered over. He stayed close to her and didn't show much interest in the world that boys his age usually lived in. He liked helping with cooking and spending time doing small crafts. He even gravitated toward playing with his sister's dolls. None of this bothered Joanna though, and if anything, she seemed all too happy to keep Fritz sheltered. Fritz's older siblings, meanwhile, struggled in different ways, and conflict seemed to always be present in the household. One of his older brothers would eventually end up in an institution after a violent incident, and his sisters followed difficult paths their own, each becoming so-called ladies of the night. It seems that Fritz grew up surrounded by adult problems that were far beyond his understanding, and even as a small child, he showed some behaviors that made people uneasy. He dreamed up controlling or unsettling games that would end with his sisters bound in string or rope, and he enjoyed scaring neighbors or siblings in a way that went beyond normal mischief. In school, teachers described Fritz as polite and manageable, but academically he lagged behind. He apparently repeated grades and had trouble staying focused, and he much preferred drifting through the school day rather than engaging with the work he needed to do. There wasn't much about his classroom behavior that hinted at what he would one day become, but it was clear early on that he didn't quite fit in with his peers. There was also a childhood trauma that he almost never discussed as an adult. When he was still very young, one of his teachers took advantage of him. Fritz didn't talk about the details of what happened or how it affected him, and in that era, a boy in his position didn't have many avenues to report abuse, so the teacher went unpunished. As Fritz got older, he developed into a strong, physically capable teenager, but emotionally he stayed close to his mother and distant from everyone else. After finishing school, he made a brief attempt at learning a trade, but the work didn't really hold his interest. Instead, he decided to pursue something that looked more structured and respectable, so he volunteered for a military training program. This seemed like the right decision, as the discipline and routine he received in the program provided a path that appeared to give him some direction. And for a short time at least, it looked like he had finally found some stability, but it wasn't meant to last. A few months into training, Fritz began having sudden episodes where he'd black out or collapse without warning. These were severe enough that the academy doctors couldn't ignore them, and after several evaluations, the episodes were described as being similar to epilepsy. Whether that diagnosis was accurate by modern standards doesn't really matter, because by the academy standards in 1895, it meant that Fritz was deemed no longer fit for service. So by November of that year, he was sent home, and whatever hope he had of building a new identity through the military was gone. Back in Hanover, Fritz took a job in a cigar factory, but that job didn't last long either. He didn't have the attention span for repetitive work, and being back home, he didn't have the patience to deal with his authoritarian father. Within months of his return, Fritz displayed behavior that became much more concerning than anything he had displayed to that point. At just 16 years old, Fritz started targeting boys much younger than himself. He would lure them into basements or tucked away corners of buildings, usually with promises of treats or small gifts. These encounters were, let's just say, very adult in nature, and they marked the beginning of a long pattern. His first known arrest came in July of 1896 after one of the boys reported what happened, but this did nothing to slow Fritz down. By early 1897, the situation had escalated enough that the authorities stepped in more forcefully. Fritz was evaluated by a psychologist and deemed to be incurably deranged. This was a broad and vague label used at the time for someone considered mentally unstable and dangerous. Instead of sending him to trial though, possibly due to his age, they committed him to a mental institution with the expectation that he would be staying there indefinitely. Fritz, however, had no intention of sticking around. With his mother's help and her willingness to overlook a growing list of disturbing behaviors, Fritz escaped in January of 1898. Together, they managed to get him out of the country and into Switzerland, where he lived with a relative and worked in a shipyard doing simple labor. Strangely enough, Fritz managed to keep himself out of trouble for a while. For 16 months, he stayed in Zurich without any known incidents, marking the closest thing to normalcy he had ever achieved. Unfortunately, this wasn't something he could maintain though. In 1899, for reasons that are unclear, Fritz returned to Hanover. By then, nothing had improved at home, and nothing but his internal struggles had either. In early 1900, he tried once again to find stability and became engaged to a woman named Erna, and before long she was pregnant with his child. This might have been the start of a conventional life, except the German military wasn't quite done with him, despite his illness, crimes, and clear mental instability. Later that year, he received a notice to report for compulsory service. Fritz would end up going, but it played out much like it did during his first stint. He suffered from dizzy spells that earned him long stays in the hospital, and soon enough he was discharged again. In 1902, he was sent home to Hanover, this time labeled unfit not just for service, but for heavy work of any kind. Once back in Hanover, he moved in with Erna, but their relationship wouldn't survive much longer. Fritz apparently accused her of being unfaithful, and that was enough for her to end the engagement. And from that point on, Fritz seemed to steer toward a life of crime more than ever before. He moved from one petty offense to another, often stealing, lying, and getting into fights. He held several odd jobs during this time, but was terminated when he ended up stealing from his employers. Between 1905 and 1912, he spent more time in prison than out of it. His stints were a mix of long and short sentences, but none of them seemed to do anything to change his behavior. Outside the prison walls, the stretches of freedom he experienced were filled with these same thefts, scams, and occasional assaults that landed him in jail in the first place. When he was drinking as well, which was often, his temper ran hot and only contributed to his interest in breaking the law. By 1913, Fritz had a long record, and that October, police searched his apartment during a burglary investigation and discovered a sizable stash of other stolen property. This earned him a conviction on charges of burglary and fraud, and he was given 5 years in prison. When he finally walked free again in 1918, the world around him had changed dramatically. Germany had just come out of World War I, battered and economically devastated. Work was tough to come by, and the streets were crowded with displaced people. Almost overnight, Hanover was filled with thousands of young men drifting into the city searching for food or work. Fritz joined these masses and re-entered society with no money or family support, and he went right back to the same behaviors he had relied on before, but now he was in an environment that made crime a lot easier. The police force was understaffed and overwhelmed, so it was impossible for authorities to manage the increase in thefts and black market trading happening throughout Hanover. In all of this madness, Fritz somehow found an unexpected opportunity by talking to the police instead of hiding from them. He shared tips about other criminals and offered small bits of information that made him appear helpful. Soon enough, Hanover officers came to see him as a convenient source of valuable intel. And what they didn't see right away was that this arrangement was a shield of sorts for Fritz. The more helpful he seemed, the less likely anyone was to closely look at the crimes he was committing, and it worked. By 1919, he was wandering the central station as if he was some kind of an unofficial authority there. He wasn't officially an officer, but he acted like one, and few people questioned it. The area around the main train station had become a magnet for anyone looking to hustle a few coins or barter for food, and the Schieber market across the street from the station had an entire system of its own. You could buy clothes, meat, tools, or pretty much anything else that could be scavenged, and it was a place where young runaways were some of the easiest to exploit. A stranger offering bread or a temporary place to sleep didn't seem suspicious at all, and Fritz thrived in this type of environment. He confronted pickpockets and lectured runaways about staying out of trouble, and that was enough to make people assume he had some kind of authority. And this appearance of being a legitimate officer made young runaways more willing to follow him. It's believed that Friedel was the first of Fritz's victims, and it was definitely the first case that put Fritz onto the radar of police as something more than a petty criminal and occasional informant. Friedel was 17 years old when he left home in 1918, and Fritz was able to earn Friedel's trust during their very first interaction. Again, as mentioned earlier, the two went back to Fritz's apartment under the guise of an invitation to stay with him, and with that, Friedel vanished. A month later, when police found Fritz in an extremely compromising position with another young runaway, authorities became so wrapped up in that crime that Friedel's disappearance almost became an afterthought. What makes this even more disturbing is that in hindsight, Friedel's case was the moment when everything might have been stopped before it escalated. Police had the right suspect, the right address, and the right timing, but they just weren't thorough enough. Instead of finding him, Friedel's whereabouts remained a mystery, and Fritz was off to serve a short 9-month stint in prison for his assault of the third boy he was caught with. Sometime around this time, potentially after Fritz's release, he met Hans Grans. Hans was 18 years old and trying to survive on his own after leaving home behind. He had been in Hanover only for a short time, sleeping near the train station and selling pieces of clothing he found. He obviously wasn't well off, but there was apparently a confidence about him or the way he looked that completely struck Fritz. It immediately made Hans stand out among the other runaways who passed through the station every day. And by the time Fritz noticed Hans already knew about Fritz. Their first conversation led to Fritz offering Hans a warm place to sleep and a steady supply of food, but Hans didn't need much convincing. Unbeknownst to Fritz, Hans had planned to take advantage of Fritz first. Although Hans was heterosexual, he planned to use the situation to his advantage. Hans then moved into Fritz's apartment and the two developed a close yet complicated relationship. Fritz became deeply attached quickly, and Hans liked having a roof over his head and the stability that came with someone older looking out for him. And over time, Hans learned exactly how much power he had in the relationship. If he wanted a particular jacket or pair of shoes, Fritz made sure it ended up in the apartment. If Hans wanted more spending money, Fritz found a way to get it. They apparently frequently engaged in dramatic arguments, but no matter how ugly things got, Fritz always took Hans back. Soon enough, Hans even saw the way Fritz approached other boys at the station under the pretense of helping them or warning them to stay out of trouble. He watched Fritz come home with items that clearly belonged to other people and did absolutely nothing to stop any of it. If anything, Hans benefited from what Fritz was doing. Over time, Hans even encouraged Fritz's patterns without directly saying so. If he liked the look of a coat someone was wearing, he told Fritz, and Fritz paid close attention to these comments. There was apparently a distinct connection between what Hans admired and what would suddenly appear in the apartment. Between 1918 and 1924, Fritz developed a routine at the station. Most of the boys he targeted were runaways or commuters passing through the city or on their way to work. Some were barely teenagers, while others were in their late teens or early 20s. What they all had in common was their willingness to trust someone who appeared to have authority. Fritz would approach them, ask questions, offer help, and acted like he was someone steering them away from trouble. And once he gained their trust, he turned the conversation toward the idea of a place to rest or some kind of assistance he claimed he could provide. Once inside of his apartment, though, the kind and helpful dynamic shifted quickly. Fritz would feed them and give them a place to sit, but what came next would eventually earn Fritz the nickname, the Vampire of Hanover. When they were off guard enough, Fritz would lunge forward and literally bite their throats. He often targeted the Adam's apple, and there is more than one account of him biting through a victim's trachea completely. Many victims actually died from being unable to breathe while choking on their own blood, and this became Fritz's signature way of dispatching his victims. Once dead, a victim's body would be dismembered, and after this process was complete, he usually disposed of the remains in the Leine River, but maybe not always. A separate part of what he became known for in the area was selling meat on the black market. The conditions in post-war Germany created a steady demand for cheap food, and Fritz frequently sold ground or diced meat of a non-specific origin. Because his prices were lower than other butchers in the area, rumors spread quickly that this meat wasn't normal. These rumors later became speculation about what he might have done with parts of his victims. Now, to be clear, no physical proof ever confirmed these claims, but still, the potential connection between his meat sales and the missing boys was unthinkable. With so many transient youths arriving and leaving each week, it wasn't always obvious when someone went missing. Even when families did report disappearances, the cases often blended into a long list of similar reports with little to go on. The combination of his access to the state of the city at the time and his relationship with the police allowed Fritz to keep this up for 6 years. During that time, dozens of young men crossed his path and stepped into his apartment, only to never make it out. This all finally changed in the spring of 1924, though. The first discovery came from a group of children playing near the banks of the Leine River. They spotted something lodged near the water's edge, and upon closer examination, they realized it was a human skull. It didn't take long for word to spread and a crowd to begin forming near the river. At first, people assumed it might have belonged to a drowning victim, but the situation grew far more serious when another skull was found less than 2 weeks later. Then, by early summer, another group of local boys playing along the river came across a sack filled with bones. That discovery made it clear that this wasn't just a couple of isolated tragedies. Police began a formal recovery effort, dragging sections of the river and scanning the banks for additional remains, and what they found was staggering. Bone after bone surfaced until there were hundreds of them. Forensic specialists examined the remains and determined they belonged to multiple individuals, all of them young males. Estimates varied, but the general consensus was that there were at least 20 bodies, possibly more. The conditions of the bones also indicated that the bodies had been dismembered. Once these details became public, the mood in Hanover shifted. Families with missing sons began flooding police stations with questions, and citizens continued to gather near the river to watch the recovery teams work. Newspapers also seized on the discoveries, turning the investigation into a spectacle and fueling widespread panic. Behind the scenes, investigators began compiling lists of young men reported missing over the previous years. As they compared those names with the approximate ages and characteristics of the victims, investigators determined that many of the missing had last been seen near the central station. Detectives from outside the city were then brought in to take over the case because the local force was too overwhelmed by the sheer number of missing person reports that had piled up in the previous 6 years. These outside investigators came in with fresh eyes, and they began mapping the last known movements of the missing boys. And it didn't take long before the same name kept popping up, Fritz Haarmann. Witnesses remembered seeing him talking to the boys who later disappeared. His landladies also described unusual behavior in his apartments over the years, and several acquaintances had received clothing or personal items from him that he claimed to have acquired through trades. When police compared these details to those of their growing list of victims, there was significant overlap. Investigators soon put Fritz under secret surveillance. They didn't want to spook him and cause him to flee, but they needed first-hand observation of how he acted around the station. One evening, while following him through crowds, they saw him arguing with a teenage boy right outside the station building. This exchange escalated quickly enough that detectives stepped in to separate them, and then they took both of them in for questioning. With their top suspect now in custody, police returned to Fritz's apartment again and gave it a thorough search this time. And this time, they found clothing stained with blood, items that matched descriptions from families of the missing, and clear signs that violent acts had taken place there. One section of his apartment was even heavily stained with dried blood. As this was going on, police began questioning him as well. At first, he denied even knowing what the police were talking about, but that strategy didn't last long. When he was confronted with the evidence found in his apartment after several hours of pressure, Fritz started to come clean. The truth trickled out in a series of confessions, but eventually he admitted to killing a large number of young men, maybe somewhere between 30 to 40 of them. He apparently just couldn't help himself and couldn't even remember exactly how many because he'd lost count. During these interview sessions, Fritz also brought up Hans and his potential involvement in the killings. At times, Fritz insisted that Hans had nothing to do with the murders, only to later state that Hans encouraged him or specifically pointed out boys whose belongings he wanted. This left investigators to sift through numerous contradictory statements to determine what might actually be the truth. Once these were done with, the trial that followed became a national fixation. Germany was still dealing with political turmoil and economic issues, and Fritz's case offered a distraction for the public. Crowds packed the courtroom and reporters filled in where they could to cover the proceedings, which moved quickly once things got underway. It wrapped up in just less than 2 weeks with close to 200 witnesses taking the stand. By December 19, 1924, the verdict was in. Fritz was declared mentally competent and convicted of 24 separate murders. He would deny 3 of the charges, and the court ruled that there wasn't enough evidence to tie him to those, but everything else stuck, and he was sentenced to death by guillotine. When Fritz heard the ruling, he didn't try to protest or try to argue his way out of it. He told the court he accepted the decision and said he was prepared to face his executioner. His calm reaction was in sharp contrast to that of Hans, who was also tried at the same time and was found guilty of urging Fritz to kill at least one of the victims. Hans was also sentenced to death, which caused him to faint shortly after hearing the verdict. Fritz's execution was carried out on the morning of April 15, 1925, in front of a small crowd that included no members of the media. Reports from those there described Fritz as looking tense and drained on the morning of his execution. Not long after the trial, a letter Fritz had written to Hans's father was discovered, which insisted that Hans had never known he was killing anyone. Because of this letter, Hans was granted a second trial in early 1926, but he was found guilty a second time. This time, though, instead of a death sentence, Hans received 2 12-year prison terms to be served at the same time. Hans would end up serving his time and was eventually released in the mid-1940s. After his death, Fritz's head was taken for further examination and it was determined that his brain showed signs of meningitis. Morbidly, it would remain preserved in formaldehyde and kept in a German medical school until it was eventually cremated in 2014. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.